I want to talk briefly about some of the core practices that I use in my work with Awakening in Life. But first I want to say that if you have your own unique path that you've been on using different practices, this is totally okay. The core practices I'm going to talk about here are more categories of practices. There are so many different flavors of practices that we can do, and we can easily work together with the practices that you have and be able to help you more to deepen into those practices and integrate them into your life more fully. However, I think you might find some of these categories of practices interesting because in my experience, they can include quite a lot from multiple spiritual traditions. In particular, I emphasize meditation, but meditation does take different forms, not just sitting. Meditation takes form in movement. It makes use out of all of our senses, our seeing, our hearing, our voice, and of course our body. So these practices that I focus on here, I'm going to list them out sequentially, but they don't have to occur in a linear fashion. But I have listed them out here because they make sense in sort of a linear fashion, but they're kind of circular as well. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This does not include all of the practices that I might do or that we might do together, or especially all the practices that could be incredibly useful. This is just a nice reference and a starting point for a path, or for if you're already on the path and you're feeling you need a change, one of these practices or areas of practice might be helpful for you to pay attention to. So the first practice is settling, and there are several practices related to this. You might have know of mindfulness or of concentration practices. But settling, what we're trying to do is simply settle our mind, body, and heart and our emotions and let everything just settle and come into ourselves and let us relax a little bit. In today's times, in the modern times, we are busy and doing, and our minds are going, and that's okay. That's part of what it means to be alive today. But to really deepen into our experience, we first must let go a little bit and simply allow ourselves to come to center. And settling, we focus on something in particular to help us with that, like our breath. So you could do that right now by just taking a couple simple breaths, little slow breaths, inhaling, exhaling, inhaling, exhaling. And right there, just focusing on a couple breaths, we can probably notice that our minds slow down a little bit, our breathing slowed down a little bit, maybe some emotions or reactivity we have slowed down a little bit. We also might notice that maybe we feel like things are getting kicked up. But usually what this means is that we're starting to notice how unsettled we are, and that is part of the practice of settling. To simply notice how busy we might be constantly without even knowing it. So that's the settling practice. This allows us again to create a foundation from which we can do other practices. The next practice is being, or non-doing. Now this is an interesting one because if the practice is being and non-doing, the question is, what the heck do you do? But so many practices, core practices of meditation traditions focus on simply being. So again, if we're always doing, the practice here is to cultivate simply being, where we don't do anything at all. We are just breathing, we're just existing. We're not trying to do anything, we're not trying to control our experience, we're not trying to not control it. So this takes a little bit of nuance. It takes us being settled usually first for us to start to let go more deeply and to just be. So being often really involves letting go of something, letting go of often control. Somehow we want to control our experience. And with being, we get to simply just relax and be present. Being also, this practice of being can also be seen as somewhat of a culmination of practice, where if we're able to do this, then what else is there to do? However, it's an important thing to start cultivating at some point in your path, even if you don't feel like you can just be at the moment's notice on command. It's incredibly helpful. And settling, the practice I just mentioned, is a nice first step towards that. When we settle and focus on our breathing, for example, then we can let go of the breath and just relax. And we might start noticing ways in which we start trying to do things again, and then we let go and just be. The next practice is listening. And this practice here is similar to being, except that we have a certain presence to pay attention. So we might sit in open awareness or openness with our body. And the key here is if we were to listen to sounds right now and we try to go hunt for sounds, this is listening with focus. So I might find a sound and now I'm really trying to listen to that sound. The practice of listening here means to listen without focus. Our hearing is just open. So there is a tension, there is some directionality to this in that we are focused on the experience of listening, but we're not trying to prioritize any particular sound. Sounds just come and go. And we experience what listening is like, and we also get to experience the silence in between sounds. And a lot of interesting things happen here. We can also do this with our sight, so we can see, and what is it like to see without focus? So this is different than simply kind of clouding over in our vision and we're spacing out, and it's different than really honing in on a particular object. That can be really helpful too, by the way. That's a practice that can help us settle and cultivate concentration. But here, we're just trying to let seeing happen. And here, with these two practices of listening without focus and seeing without focus, you might notice that it feels similar to being. We're allowing our seeing to just be. We're allowing our listening to just be. But it's a subtle difference, and it can be very useful to explore. The next practice is inquire, or inquiry. And here, we're going deeper into our experience and holding a question. We're investigating reality on a deeper level. We're investigating our own experience on deeper levels. And we might ask the question simply like, who am I? And here we're not trying to come up with an analytical answer. We're trying to feel and experience what comes up when I say, who am I? And we start exploring the nature of who we actually are on a deeper level. Who am I? Am I my thoughts? Am I my feelings? Am I my body? Am I space? Am I creative energy? Who am I? And with inquiry, what's really important is to not rush to find an answer, to not rush to find some sort of conceptual conclusion that we can rest on, but instead to find a direct experience that we embody, that we are. The answer arises as us, as our experience. And here we get much more familiar with reality itself, and when we have these experiences in inquiry, we can experience some particularly profound shifts in our life and how we relate to ourselves, others, and life. The next practice is respond, or response. So when we go through these practices like settling and listening, being, inquiring, all of a sudden when we are natural presence, when we are just as we are, we're not having to manipulate or control experience, yet we're still very present to experience. We are very much here. And it seems like a paradox that even though I'm not trying to control anything, I still have experiences. I still feel things. So if I see somebody smiling, I experience joy as a response to that smile. If somebody's hurting, my heart hurts. I might feel sadness as a direct response to what I'm experiencing. So here we can tune into a response that's much more rooted deeply in ourselves and in life. And from there we can respond to life in a more natural way. And particular profound experiences of this, it feels like there's nobody doing anything and yet something happens. But even when it's not so deeply profound like that, my experience is that things feel more in a flow. That even if confusion is arising or excitement's arising, something natural, it's something more natural is happening here, and I can respond more easily. And this leads us to the last practice of trust. So trust also involves some letting go here. If we are coming from a place of being settled, of being and listening, we can respond and we can trust that response. However, this trust part can be really difficult, especially in life, because there's so many things happening. There's so much change. It's hard to pin down reality. Everything is moving. And so at some point we have to let go and trust ourselves, trust others, trust life on some level when we come from this deeply rooted place. To even trust that if we need to change directions or change response, we can do that. To trust that we can pay attention. To trust that we have certain capacities within us that we can rely upon. To trust certain things that, for example, is reality itself fundamentally whole? Are we fundamentally whole on some level? And if so, can I trust that? Trust also usually brings up a lot of pain and wounds and trauma in us. And our response to that is usually to seek healing practices or healing modalities like psychotherapy or healing with wellness practitioners, because we find ways in which it's very hard to trust. And so we have to honor that and pay attention to that and find ways to work with that. And of course, this leads us all back to all the other practices I mentioned, which is why it's not strictly linear. So we can really see how these practices that I mentioned here can really weave in and out of each other. And even sometimes you can take up a practice that emphasizes more than one of these practices at once, or even in one session. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of practices. It's just a starting point. It's a good reference point, in my experience, to help me reflect on my own practice, on my life, and to see what it is I might need in a particular moment. And again, you may have already a path of awakening, a path of meditation that you've been on for a while, and whatever practices you have in this moment, bring that into our sessions together. And if it makes sense to explore some of these categories of practices that I mentioned, then we can do that. However, as you've probably gathered, my emphasis really is on responding to what is arising and what is needed right now. And so that's where I would bring you in, and I welcome you to share your experience of what it is you need right now. And let's start there. Thank you.